Hello and welcome to this special edition of the Negotiation Room, where, of course, I am joined once again by co-conspirator Keld Jensen. Keld, great to see you again.
You too, Tim.
So, well, today we're picking up on a piece of research we did, which I know quite excited you, actually. It was a little bit unprompted and unplanned, but it was derived from an email you sent me where you had done a profile of me as a negotiator, and you started and we had an interesting conversation about whether or not this was a good thing, a bad thing, was it useful, not useful. Well, we won't go straight into what it led to, but our topic today is win-win or just winning, because the net of the findings, Keld, gave us some insight as to why perhaps it's so difficult to get to a win-win scenario.
Absolutely. And Tim, thank you so much for doing the whole thing. It was a lot of work, but I really appreciate the outcome. And I can only encourage everybody to read that paper because it's so interesting. Let's just dive into the numbers straight away, because what your research found, Tim, was something that I had suspected for years without having the numbers. So that is, everybody's talking about they want to be collaborative, but in reality, not so much. And the secret is not really, and I hope you agree with me, Tim, is because human beings don't want to collaborate, but we do what we're being measured on, right?
Well, yes, that's absolutely right. Of course, as you say, this is something, certainly in terms of people's wish to or preference to be collaborative, that, of course, has come up year in, year out in the most negotiated terms, to a point where we stopped even asking the question because it was quite pointless, because everybody always said, yeah, it's not me who isn't collaborative, it's the other side.
Right.
So we have this study, which was a mix of buy side, sell side. Each of them said, yep, we want to collaborate, and each said, but the other side doesn't. Now, to be fair, some did acknowledge that often there were internal impediments, that perhaps the attitudes of some in the organization, perhaps internal risk aversion, perhaps more legalistic thinking that isn't necessarily, I think you and I have often talked about it. I think it was the Dean of George Washington Law School who once said to me, we don't teach win-win here. And of course that is an underlying problem, isn't it? That if we view contracts predominantly as legal instruments, lawyers don't look for win-win. I mean, if you're litigating, there isn't really such a thing.
That's absolutely right. Now, just before we get started, I have to share with everybody, I'm slightly biased because I am what I call myself a commercial negotiator. And on top of that, I believe strongly in collaborative negotiation. Not just because I think we should be nice to each other, because I strongly believe, and it's been researched and proven as well, it simply generates more value. And on top of that, Tim, I want to share a scary story I just had a few months ago. I was working with a major energy company. I'm not going to mention any names. It was their procurement and supply chain and contract management. And after 2 days workshop, one of the procurement professionals raised his hand and then he asked this question, and I quote, "Isn't it unethical to be transparent and honest in a negotiation with a supplier?" Did you get that question, Tim? Isn't it unethical to be transparent and honest in a negotiation? And Tim, you know me, I'm normally not missing words, but in that situation, I really didn't know what to say, because first I thought he was kidding, and then I realized he was actually serious. And just to finish the story, Tim, when I was walking through reception at that major energy company, like most companies, they had screened in the reception saying, we are in partnership with our suppliers, and honesty is a value, and we want to be transparent. And I'm just thinking, Tim, and I apologize my language, but is that just a load of BS? The corporations are saying all of that because they seem to, based on your research, to be measuring and incentivize the employees to do something quite differently, huh?
Yeah, I mean, we have been doing a lot more work recently, just looking at essentially, you will recall our work historically that the contracts procurement legal practitioner tends to be preventist. They see their role as preventing bad things from happening. So I guess if you take the view that you are, in a sense, protecting your company, then it isn't a completely far-fetched stretch to say, well, in that case, I can't really reveal too much information because I need to hold it and keep it close to my chest, which is what we saw. I think it is really interesting too that when we look at this from the point of view of professional standards, there's some dialogue going on at the moment because one of the procurement associations is campaigning for the anointment of procurement as licensed procurement professionals, and that without their approval, nobody can buy anything, which is a really interesting position. Personally, I think it's a bit Luddite in the sense that, trying to protect after the horse is bolted. The truth is that, AI empowerment in various forms is going to actually shift this dynamic quite substantially.
Yes.
But I think it does come back to that same point that if I'm convinced that I am somehow the guardian of my company's interests, that does shade the way I negotiate. But is that the fault of the people? When I'm working with some systems designers at the moment who have been saying, no, it's not the fault of the people, it's the fault of the measurement system. And actually, when we look at the measurements that are typically applied to people in procurement, particularly, they are a major inhibitor to win-win, because they're very much about aspects of win-lose.
Yes. Yes,
but I know
absolutely.
You've got some bits of data you've put together on some fantastic slides, Keld. So should we start showing the audience some of what we found?
Exactly. One of them is this one. And I think there are two percentage numbers here that are really interesting, isn't it? Because 85% plus, and it varies a little bit when you dive into the specific numbers, but 85% describe themselves as collaborative or mostly collaborative. And when I saw that number, Tim, from your study, I was applauding. I thought this is great because this is basically supporting what I was hoping for and what I kind of had a feeling for myself. But I like numbers, so that was great. But then I read this second line, and then I got very depressed because that reads that only 16% are incentivized by the organization to create a win-win outcome. And as I said when we got started here, Tim, people have a tendency to do what they're being measured on, right? So if you're being measured on just getting a better price or shorter delivery time and not being transparent and collaborative, your culture will be based on that measurement. And even though you are collaborative, you're then going to move into more positional behavior. So I could add one more thing, and that is it's a waste of time training an organization in collaborative negotiation if the system in the organization is not prepared for it, isn't it?
It is. I mean, of course, this reinforces the point I made before with our system designers that said precisely this. And of course, so many times negotiators aren't actually directly incentivized on an outcome at all. Or if they are, it's not the ultimate outcome. It is the outcome of the specific negotiations. So if the outcome I'm being measured on is, did I get compliance with my standard template? Well, that is really, it's never going to be a win-win outcome, is it?
Right, exactly. I would also add one more thing that I have found in my work, and that is that we also interpret collaboration very differently. What is collaboration? And, some procurement organizations believe they're collaborative if they're giving an order to a supplier. They call that collaborative behavior. Collaborative in my world is that if you're willing to take on a cost to help your counterpart gain an even higher profit, and obviously the counterpart is then compensating your cost, the asymmetric value. If you're willing and able to share those costs and benefit, you are in a true collaborative negotiation. And your study here, Tim, is so great because that covers that part as well. And one of the things that we're going to see in a few minutes is that people are perhaps saying they are collaborative, but at the end of the day, they're not really willing to share cost and benefit. Isn't that true?
It is, yes. I mean, that reluctance to share information, which comes out so clearly, and that, as we know, is driven by the absence of any real trust, isn't it? That it's very difficult to determine how much and to what extent can I trust you. And to be fair, in business to business environment, anybody who claims that there is a commitment to trustworthy behavior is probably delusional, because you know, you can have a change of CEO, you can have a change of market conditions, and
right.
Collaboration is really about convenience at a moment in time. And it's a question of how sustainable that collaboration will actually turn out to be. I mean, look at where we are now, where many procurement groups are going out looking for alternative sources of supply because they're worried about supply resilience. A very legitimate concern. But that supplier who a year ago was being told, you're absolutely tremendous, we absolutely want to commit to you. Well, actually, you're shipping from a place that's no longer really convenient to us, or which we deem too risky. So, sorry, but the collaboration is over. So, Keld, I think we do have to be realistic about the boundaries of true collaboration. Again, not be too critical, because inevitably, as employees of an organization, those listening to us today do have their first and foremost duty to their company.
Absolutely. And I normally say the following, Tim. There's only one reason why two commercial organizations negotiate, and that is to create and distribute value, right? There's really no other reasons why two commercial organizations are negotiating. And here comes the important fact, and this is a fact, and that is, if you are collaborative, not being naive, but if you are collaborative and looking for that asymmetric value that we call negotiation economics, if you can find that asymmetric value, you're going to get wealthier, but not at the expense of the counterpart. And the counterpart is going to get wealthier, but not at the expense of you. However, that requires, back to what we just talked about, transparency, sharing your cost and my value. Now, there's a couple of challenges here because, you know, I've been in this world for about 30 years, Tim. And, you know, when I get pushback from organizations saying, well, your approach is naive, you know, being open and transparent, and we can't do that, then I'm often challenging even the average individual, the procurement officer, and saying, okay, which of the variables in your organization are you not allowed to share with the counterpart? Are you allowed to share your cost of capital? And they go, well, there's no rule against it. Okay, are you allowed to share your cost of warehousing? And then they normally go, well, there's no rule against it. Are you allowed to? And then I just continue down that list, and we can find 300 plus variables. And yes, there might be variables they are not allowed to share, and I completely respect that. But you know what's interesting, Tim? Quite often, there's actually not a limitation on the value or cost they're allowed to share, but they just independently and individually decide, I'm not going to share that, because if I share that, you know, the counterpart is going to abuse that information. And then I have to take one step back, and I'm sorry about my monologue here, but it's very close to my heart. And that is, most of them forget to negotiate on how to negotiate before they start negotiating. And why am I saying that? I'm saying that because we perceive negotiation very differently. There's not a right and a wrong, by the way, but you may perceive negotiation like playing tennis, and I might perceive it like playing chess, right? And if we look at it that differently, we're going to have an awkward couple of hours in the beginning because we're playing two different games. So what a lot of organizations is missing out completely is having a pre-negotiation before they negotiate, deciding, are we going to share data? Are we going to be open? And what happens if we actually share those asymmetric value? How are we going to split that? They just go straight into it, and then they take that traditional approach that I'm not sharing anything, because if I'm doing that, the counterpart's going to abuse that information. So I think it's really important important to, as an organization, think about, is that something we really want? And then you have to support the negotiators on doing that. But I remember, Tim and I, we've known each other for many years now, Tim. And I remember many years ago, I never forgot that, you actually told me that a lot of organizations don't trust their negotiators, right? So they don't equip them with the tools to negotiate because they're afraid of there's going to abuse that information and give it all away. Do you actually remember that conversation, Tim?
I do. I was just thinking about it actually as you were speaking, because I think that remains somewhat true. Be it interesting, love to have comments from the audience. Please use chat. Do you have insight to the cost breakdowns, the financial analysis that would actually help you to understand? Or are you just given some financial parameters that says you can't go beneath this or above that, without any real insight to what the makeup is, where the trade-offs might come?
You actually, sorry to interrupt you, Tim, because we are talking about sharing that, and you actually covered that in the study as well by the information sharing. I'm just showing that on the slide right now because this is kind of interesting. Perhaps you want to talk us through this slide here, Tim.
Yeah, well, I'm also going to challenge some of this data because I think it's a little bit disingenuous or perhaps incomplete. How open are people if they think they've really got a performance issue? Well, I don't think that the average negotiator actually is particularly honest at all. Procurement are not really going to say, well, to be honest, Keld, I don't think we've really got the capability to perform on our side of the responsibility. Because what does that mean? You're going to say, well, in that case, the price goes up. And if I'm on the sell side, am I really going to say, I'm trying to win this business? So I'm not really going to say, I'm a bit worried about whether or not we've got the right skills for doing this. They're really busy at the moment. It might not be available in time. Well, if we really wanted a collaborative win-win, then of course that sort of conversation would take place. But there aren't many incentives to be that honest. And so as you go down this list, risk concerns too. I've been there. I've been there where your sales team, your account managers will certainly not thank you as a negotiator if you start talking about market factors that could be disruptive. They want to get the signature. They don't want doubt put in the way.
Right.
If I may, Keld, I think there's a couple of other points. So firstly, do people have the information they need to really be able to develop that collaborative shared outcome, best economic model? Interesting question to ask your counterparty before you start the negotiation. What level of information do you have access to? If I were to ask you for cost information, do you actually have it? That's quite telling. I think a second point is to build collaboration, it has to be around a shared objective, something you've both bought into. And of course, different negotiations have a different level of motivation. If I'm winning a deal to build an Olympic stadium, that's pretty motivational. That's something I'm excited by. My company just won a deal to build an Olympic. Wow, did they really? So there are deals and there are deals. But I think the third thing that's really interesting is the readiness not just to have those conversations, not just to have some openness, transparency, but also to pick up on the point we started discussing, which is my collaboration is conditional. Now, if we're really going to then build a collaborative relationship and build a level of trust, that potentially takes us into some uncomfortable conversations. And people often prefer to avoid that. Actually, can I have a termination for convenience clause? What? But you just said we're collaborating. You just said we're partners. And now you're already planning a divorce.
That's right. Right.
And that's not the only clause. So you'll recall we've done work looking at 16 terms and conditions that we believe in today's uncertain environment need to be designed to be adaptive.
Right.
But many of those require a level of honesty around the truth that our commitment is always conditional. And mature negotiators should be able to introduce those factors into the conversation, because without them, you can't really build trust.
Right. Absolutely. And that brings us back to one of my favorite topics of them all, and that is trust. One of my favorite themes to talk about in negotiation is trust currency, the two words trust and currency put together. And that's a term I coined simply because in my world, trust is a monetary value. I meet a lot of negotiators, Tim, who says, well, trust is nice to have. I get that. And I correct them and say, no, it's a need to have, because I did my doctorate studying trust and AI in negotiation. And my aim was to try and put a monetary value on trust. And thank God I succeeded. And what I found very quickly was that if we have a high level of trust in negotiation, we can generate up to 34% more value compared to negotiation with low level of trust. So trust is something that we can put a monetary value on. And let me just share this slide here, because this is so important as well. And one of the findings that you got in the paper here, Tim, because the first mover trap is so important. Because we often find that people, back to what we said, 85% want to be collaborative, and they actually want to share the information, but they end up in this situation here, prisoner's dilemma almost, where they say, well, I'll share my data if you'll share yours. I have to emphasize, Tim, I'm not doing it anymore, but when I was about 5 or 6 on the playground, I was playing this game with the girls. I'll show you mine if you show me yours. I don't know whether I can say that now, a podcast, but I just did. I've stopped doing it, by the way. This is very important. I'm not doing it anymore. But it's the same thing really in any negotiation, right? I'll show you my cost of benefit if you show me your cost of benefit. And I'm just mentioning it right now, Tim, because trust is the key thing here. If I don't trust you, it's not going to happen, is it? And if you don't trust me, it's not going to happen either. So one of the things that I often encourage organizations to do is verbalize trust, talk about trust before we start negotiating. And I have a question for you, Tim, because I get a lot of pushback on that as well from organizations saying, you can't do that. We can't put trust on the agenda. And I say, why not? And they say, no, because then the counterpart will almost think that we don't trust them. Well, that could happen, obviously. But in general, I feel, why not talk about the elephant in the room? Why not talk about trust? So Tim, would it be okay if I verbalize if I feel that trust is declining? And would it be okay that we work together to increase trust? That's how I typically go around that topic. What's your take on that, Tim?
Two things, perhaps, quickly. One, the extent of trust is, I think, built around experience. Yes, you certainly can do due diligence on the behavior of the counterparty in the marketplace, which perhaps gives you a modicum of trust in their ethical standards, in their keeping the extent to which they keep their word, if you like, and have a reputation for fair dealing. So that gives you, I suppose, a foundation of trust, though, as we know, that trust level is probably going to differ quite substantially across different cultures and jurisdictions.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
So again, it's such a tricky area because, we've seen this. Actually, it was a study we've recently been doing on the Gulf states, where trust of people and organizations within their jurisdiction is really high. Trust with people from outside their jurisdiction is really low.
Yeah.
So two absolutely divergent negotiation styles. The internal negotiations all predicated around trust, friendly, no real issues around the allocation of risks, no real focus on the penalties, the liabilities, indemnities. We don't think them. We trust each other. We're operating in the same system. Go outside the system. I want performance guarantees. I want bonds. I want a parent company guarantee. because I don't trust you.
Mm,
So it's a tricky issue, and it builds over time, and of course can
mm,
quickly be lost. I
mm,
think where we go with this very often, Keld, as you know, is to really think about the components of relational contracting that
mm,
actually trust can be built if you've got
mm,
mechanisms that you
mm,
trust.
mhm,
So it's not necessarily I have to trust you. It's
mm,
if I can trust the mechanisms we've got for dealing with things that you do that I don't like or which surprise me, then I
mm,
begin to at least trust our agreement.
absolutely. Yeah, and I think, we all know that trust is something that takes time to build and you can lose it in a couple of seconds, right? So obviously, especially in relational contracting and our concept of negotiation called partnership, they're very closely related. It's really essential, and it's just really important that we focus on it and talk about it. And back to this paper right here, I really think that is not mentioned in wording so much in the paper, but trust is really the underlining thing that creates that collaborative moment and opportunity. If trust is not there, collaboration is obviously not going to work, whether the system is there or not.
Cal,
One other thing.
Cal,
Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
Cal, if I may just quickly, you will
sure.
recall, we've done a number of experiments with
Hmm.
different groups, and I think this was one we maybe even did back in the COVID times when everybody was having to negotiate virtually. And you
Hmm.
may remember we had some sort of negotiation challenge, and we were, um, uh, well, we were operating in an environment where we had mature, experienced teams, people who
Hmm.
viewed themselves as really experienced, great
Hmm.
negotiators, always
Hmm.
win-win for me. And
Right.
we had way less experience, people who'd maybe only been in the job for a year, 18
Hmm.
months.
Hmm.
And do you recall the more
Yes, I do.
experienced negotiators,
I did. Yes.
they didn't even manage to reach an agreement, let alone a
No.
win-win agreement,
No.
because they were so reluctant to divulge
Hmm.
information to each other because they were
Right.
afraid that that could put
Right.
them at a disadvantage. And those new negotiators, they reached an agreement in like 10 minutes. Oh, you want to know that? Yeah, here, look. Oh,
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And it just reminds me when I once in a while have the opportunity of working with young students at my university doing a master degree before they are coming out in real life. I see the same thing right there, Tim. The young early 20, mid 20s reach an agreement without any major issues. And then I go out in real life and work with people in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and they struggle to reach an agreement on the exact same simulation. So it seems that life gets in the way, huh?
well,
It's
life and measurements. So, those fresh, enthusiastic, new entrant graduates, etc., they're quickly taught redlining, got to do
right,
redlining. Oh,
right, right,
okay, well, so I guess the more red lines I can create, the better I am at my job. I
right.
mean, I remember being there when I first got into the field of contracting. People said, you've got to
Mm,
review this contract for all the problems. So I did. And it
right,
was easy to come up with a list of 50 or 60. And,
right, right.
I could never understand why the sales teams weren't
Mm,
grateful to me.
true. I actually recall one of the recent summits at the closing speech that you and Sally delivered. I enjoyed that as usual. But one of the things you guys said was you basically told the audience that they were responsible for change. And I was really applauding that because, where is change coming from? We can't just sit down and wait for the management to make a change because that may or may never happen. We have to do it ourselves, right? So if we actually claim we are collaborative, if we want to work collaborative, well, then we have to negotiate internally as well. So not only do we have to negotiate with our supplier, we have to negotiate with our management and challenge them in saying, you know what we're doing right now is not really bright because we can do better, we can do more, we can be more profitable if we change our mindset. And I just feel, and now I'm being rude, right? But I just feel there's a lot of people who are just sitting there and then saying, well, I can't do anything because that's the system we got in our organization. Well, challenge that system then if it's not right. So I just want to say
Yeah.
I love you that you guys did that, because we need to push. That's the reason that I guess that WorldCC is here, that we want to change, we want to move, we want to create a change in the world, right?
Well, so much is going on. There is so much change in the world more broadly that
Yes.
maintaining and keeping up to date with the way we need to do things is increasingly difficult.
Mm,
I recall, when I was working for one of the top executives at IBM. He was actually number two in IBM at the time, Mike Armstrong, who went on to become the CEO at AT&T. And, he sat with us as a team and he said, I remember when I used to sit there and say, they should do something about this. And, if you want a successful career, there comes a time when you recognize you are they.
right, exactly.
And
Yeah.
and it is. I think, we need to, if we want to be noticed, if we want to be considered valuable, then
Mm,
we really do need to be promoting change opportunities. That doesn't mean just
mm,
throwing out willy-nilly all sorts of ideas. Of course, we need to research it. Of course, we have to have some data to back it up. But
sure.
that's what you and I are about. It's trying to give
Yeah.
people the data to make those suggestions for change. And to be
Mm,
honest, Keld, if you're somebody who never really goes forward to make change happen, um,
mm.
I think you're a pretty good candidate for AI replacement, aren't you?
Yeah, I think so. One of the questions I get a lot these days is, will I be replaced by AI? And my answer is, I really don't know. What I can promise you, though, is that those negotiators using AI will be replacing those who are not. And I also have another quote that I kind of like, and that is, if AI can do your job, it will. It's that simple. So one of the things I'm teasing, especially organizations that is doing competitive bidding, is that you won't have a job 3 years from now, because that is so automated. So AI can do that easily. So why would the company keep you? So
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
it's kind of interesting. And talking about AI, and the reason that we started the whole thing here is because we created something called the negotiation DNA, where we just, based on public available data and LinkedIn, are able to create a negotiation profile on what you are and who you are as a negotiator. And that was, I sent that to you, Tim, just to have some fun and see if you would agree or disagree with that information, because it's something that AI is generating in less than a minute. Um, and you ran this study here, which I thought was very interesting and educational as well. And it shows a little bit about human behavior as well, doesn't it? Because as we can see on the screen right now, 76% find it okay to run a profile like this on a counterpart. They find that very useful. And then typical human behavior, only 18% would welcome the counterpart doing the same to them.
yeah,
That's
absolutely.
funny, isn't it?
Yeah, reciprocity, what do you mean? Yeah, and of course, it was especially interesting that on the latter point, back to your point of unethical, 33% of those from corporate legal departments said actually giving my data to a counterparty would be unethical.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it
Yeah.
is, we have these interesting perspectives that,
Mhm. Mm,
again, you can begin to see why it's quite difficult to build that consensus, because we actually
mhm,
come at things with quite different perspectives.
mm. I actually forgot to share something a few minutes ago I want to share right now, Tim, and that is what we are often doing, back to guaranteeing transparency and honesty, is that when we are sitting with a client in a bigger, major, important negotiation, we often try to make the parties agree on a post-negotiation contract due diligence. So let's assume, Tim, you and I, we have concluded this negotiation over several months. We are signing the contract, and then I allow you to come and see my data, and you allow me to come and see your data. So that means if you have been cheating, bluffing at the negotiation table, I will figure it out, and you will do the same. And that kind of removed the motivation to lie or bluff during negotiation. Now, is this always possible? Absolutely not. Can it always be done? Absolutely not. But if we are talking about a really essential long-term partnership agreement over the next 7 years to build a stadium or a power station or what have you, it's a wonderful way of securing that if we reach an agreement, we can make sure that the counterpart is not manipulating, because if we want to, we can do a due diligence. So I would actually love the comment from our audience today, what they feel about that. Is that completely crazy, or is that something they could see themselves doing with the supplier?
Well, it takes the fun out of things, Cal, because I want to win, but I'd like to win a little bit more.
Yeah, that is actually true. That's human psychology as well, Tim. We always run these simulations when we run our workshops where people are negotiating, and then we record the highlights and give them feedback. And then we often see that people are satisfied with the outcome until they realize their counterpart got more. Then they're suddenly not happy anymore. So that's a very typical human trait as well. And I often ask them, but you were happy with your 30% 10 minutes ago. Yeah, but then I realized that they got 10% more than me. Yes, okay, fine. I think that's kind of funny as well.
Yeah, I'm fine with splitting this bar of chocolate in half. That's great. But then I suddenly discovered that you actually ate 4 squares before you split it.
Exactly. I have one more slide, and that is about a number that you got out of your study here, Tim, and that is AI is accepted but not trusted blindly. So what he's saying is that 66% are comfortable with AI in negotiation, preparation, and strategy. I was actually surprised here in 2026 that the number was only 66%, Tim. I would honestly have believed that would be a little bit higher. What's your take on that? Were you surprised by the 66 or?
I'm probably more surprised the other way, actually, Cal, because I think still a relatively high proportion of people either are not allowed to use AI, or their use of AI in the workplace is still very limited. Most of them are still in pilot mode. So
Right.
I think for many, it's still a very unknown quantity. So the fact that 66% welcome it or are not averse to it, I think is now, unfortunately, most people will not have received any meaningful training in how to use it to greatest effect, and so it's still a bit of a trial and error type model, and the use cases are quite varied too. We've just completed our 2026 benchmark of US federal contracting. And part of that was looking at the primary uses of AI in the contracting life cycle, and very interesting contrast actually between what the federal employees are using it for versus what their suppliers are using it for.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so we've got no consistency in what people currently think it's useful to do.
I just want to throw one more number in there. That is not a number that either you or I did. That was from the Vantage Group. They came up with a paper recently. They had studied, correct me if I'm wrong, about 400 or 500 organizations, and they found that the adversarial level of negotiation has increased quite a lot. It had gone up from 29%, if I recall the numbers correctly, in 2018 to about 40 something percent in 2025. It was a huge increase in more positional, combative negotiation in the last 7 years. And that's obviously depressing news as well, if their numbers are right, Tim. How do you see that increase, if that's true, in more positional negotiation, compared to the findings you got here that 85% claim they are collaborative?
Yeah. So, well, of course, these things always depend on what your audience says and what sort of things they're negotiating. I mean, if you're dealing with commodity acquisitions, then
Sure.
I'm not sure that too much has changed or will change. So you always have to know, are we actually looking at the same base of people between those years? I think you also have to recognize things can change quite significantly at moments in time. You probably, I hope, that you've been reading our geopolitical disruption report. Now, that would very much support, I think, that finding.
mm,
We drew an interesting contrast here. COVID, people by and large said, we're in this together. We need
mm,
to collaborate to find a way through. Now, it wasn't
mm,
universal. Obviously, we know quite a lot of people took advantage of it and said, oh,
mm,
I want to close my business. I want to get out of my lease. So I'm going to use
mm,
this opportunity to claim force majeure and
mm,
get rid of my contract. But by
mm,
and large, in the B2B world, it did tend to lead to a level of openness, cooperation, because we need to get through this together. Although,
mm.
although, as I remember one member saying on one of our webinars, actually, well, we were highly collaborative until we sent a bill. but, but, but that aside, what we've seen now with the geopolitical disruption is
Right.
a very negative trend of people failing to step back and say, actually, there's a bigger picture here. Um,
Mm,
I, as a supplier, I'm facing all sorts of unpredictable cost movements, tariffs that come, tariffs that go, sanctions. I'm having to move sources of supply. I'm having to be highly adaptive. And Mrs. Customer, I need your help in this.
mm, mm.
Not my
Yeah,
problem.
yeah.
But at the same time, you've got
Mm,
that customer saying, oh my goodness, I need supply resilience. How am I going to get
mm,
supply resilience? And
mm,
rather
mm,
than sitting down and talking about their respective needs, which would give them
mm,
actually a potential for a very collaborative
mm, mm,
negotiation, they are
mm,
getting stuck into positional positions,
mm,
positional positions. They-
mm,
They're getting stuck on positional approaches
mm.
on a term by term basis. I want to terminate, you can't.
Sure,
I
sure.
want a price increase, you can't.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
it is interesting, and
Mm,
I share your sense of despondency in the sense that it does demonstrate the immaturity of
mm,
many negotiation skills, negotiation practices, where
mm,
people are not stepping back and looking at that question of, is there a deal to be
mm,
done here? They're
mm,
just instantly reacting to a request.
mm. I was actually not telling the truth before, Tim, because there was one slide from the World CC or the paper here that you created. And I think that's important because it's kind of a takeaway slide that people can really take back home, and I hope they will. And I especially like the bottom line down here saying win-win is not primarily a negotiation problem, it's an organizational design problem. I think that's so true. So if we just walk through this slide here from left to right, so one of the things that I would encourage organizations to do is actually take a look at the incentive, how they incentivize negotiators in general, and redesign that. Because I think the conclusion is, we can always argue about the numbers here, but I think the conclusion is that majority of human beings actually want to collaborate. I truly believe that. But as we talked about already, Tim, we do what we're being measured on. So if we are being measured on something else, we abandon the collaborative approach and do what we can do to fulfill the numbers that we have to fulfill, right? So I think all the executives that is listening to our show right here, they have to go back and look at how do we actually promote collaboration inside our organization. Otherwise, it's kind of pointless, isn't it?
Yes, well, it is. Yes, if we want the satisfaction of win-win, if we want the satisfaction of being able to point to successful outcomes, then
Mm,
clearly incentives that drive us the opposite direction. Not
mm,
only does it not really perhaps give us a great deal of personal or professional pride, but of course
mm.
it's not really going to make us particularly popular with the rest of the business.
True.
If I'm negotiating a highly cost-based deal or a highly price leverage deal, which then in execution quickly leads to confrontation, contention, disagreement, claims, disputes. Yeah, is that
Mm,
really great for my
mm.
reputation? probably not. But unfortunately, the incentives have often driven me that way.
Absolutely.
And I think we haven't touched on this second one, but it is an interesting one. Still, I think very much under investigation, Keld, to what extent could we be using AI? And that is one of the experiments we did quite successfully that showed that if people were using AI, well, depending on which AI system they were using, of course, it did encourage them to be more open and transparent. And negotiators that took advantage of that were finishing up with far better deals far faster. So that's definitely an area for continued research, and hopefully people will experiment with a little bit. But this behavioral leadership we've touched on, the breadth of the negotiation, so that we are in a position to talk much more holistically about the different components, because any contract is an integrative document, and we typically will not be able to have all of the stakeholders in the room, and it isn't particularly desirable to. So we do need to think about the empowerment and the enablement of negotiators to really speak for the business rather than constantly having to go and get somebody's permission, which brings us back to the organizational design question.
Absolutely. I just want to touch on the mutual disclosure mechanism, because you're absolutely right, Tim. And for those of you who are not familiar with the study, it was a study that Tim and I did very early on with AI, where we had groups negotiating with each other, some without AI and some with AI. And the conclusion very quickly, you can download the peer-reviewed paper, by the way, called Friend or Foe. The conclusion was very quickly that those where both parties were using AI, they achieved a result much quicker. They found much more value than if you're not using AI. And to my big surprise anyway, Tim, I don't know if it's a surprise to you, was that honesty, transparency, and collaboration went through the roof when both parties were using AI. I didn't see that coming. And I had a lot of people asking me since then, so are you guys claiming that AI will help people become more collaborative and open and honest? And I say, well, according to the data, that seemed to be the fact, right? So it was interesting to see that reaction. Now, just back to the item number 2 here. We actually created something we call the value bridge, which is very quickly an exciting tool where each of us, Tim, you would upload your numbers, your cost and your benefit. I will do the same. Then the system will identify which of these variables that will generate asymmetric value, point it out to both of us without sharing the number. And then it will ask you and me if we're willing to share those cost and values, in what order, and one at a time, or all of them. Now we're just starting experimenting with this system, but I'm very excited to see whether that will help negotiators share more when they have a system in between that will make sure that this is going to be treated fair. Now you could still be lying about the numbers that you're sharing with the system, obviously, but let's just assume you're honest and the counterpart is honest as well. That could be a way forward where we have that neutral pilot that is assisting the negotiators by identifying that asymmetric value.
Indeed so. And that really brings us, I think, to this final number 5, the advisor and the advisory role. Tremendous need for caution there. I mean, of course, what we've just talked about can be a human intermediary who you perhaps share data with, and they can propose to you, well, based on the data you both shared, this to me looks like the optimum outcome. What do you think? And there's not much use of that, except in post-war environment, where very often to try and keep a relationship on track or whatever, you may bring in that honest broker that can help you to generate the optimum outcome. Certainly, we've done a lot of that with relational contracting, where we can act as an intermediary and operate with confidentiality, but at the same time help to bridge some of those information gaps and understanding gaps. But you do have to be very careful on the counter side, because if you bring in a third-party advisor whose only real interest is to prolong the negotiation, to act adversarially, perhaps to get a job for life in dealing with the problems that the negotiation created. That happens way too often. It's very easy because an organization doesn't feel it's got the skills it needs sometimes for complex negotiation to bring in a third party that is an expert. But you really have to be clear about what it is you expect from them, including, do you expect them to look for win-win? Are you expecting them to collaborate? Because way too often, it seems to me, they are encouraged to be adversarial and to minimize, in a sense, the value for both parties.
Yeah, and now it sounds like I'm not in favor of having attorneys or legal pros at the table. I am, and they are absolutely important. And I'm generalizing. I have met a lot of legal professionals who are being trained in negotiation, but being more positional, because that's part of the thing if you're going to court, isn't it? But a commercial negotiation where you're looking to create and distribute value is a different animal. That requires a different tool set. And if you're trained in something, you feel comfortable with that, and that's what you're going to do. So I can't even blame them. That's just the education, right? But I think it's back to what you said. I completely agree, Tim. It's very important when you, as an organization, hire somebody like that you actually understand what is it you're hiring. Are you hiring people that are in favor of collaborative negotiation? Are they coming in to do something else? So that's that's kind of an important thing as well. I think we covered a lot of great stuff here, Tim. I just hope that our audience will take some of it back home and challenge the organization to think about how they measure success in negotiation.
Indeed so, yes. I think we were both pleased that we'd found some of this breakthrough data by coming at it from a quite unexpected angle. But it has led us to a place where we perhaps have a better understanding of what the barriers are. And of course, if we want to improve, we need to understand the barriers, because then we can take action to try and remove or at least reduce them.
I actually, Tim, sorry to interrupt you again. I just want to add one thing, and that's actually from a World CC study as well. Again, I don't remember the exact number, but what was it? Was it only 16% of people participating in the study that claimed we're negotiating the right things? Which, to me, I carry that with me as well, because I think you pointed it out, Tim. So now it's not only a question how we negotiate, but what we negotiate as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, the 16%, again, it comes back, I think, to that same root cause, that the measures that are put on the organization are just not compatible with really looking at that more collaborative form of negotiation, building the mechanisms through which good governance will occur. So we very often finish up with a contract, and this has been proven with the geopolitical uncertainty, that is incapable of dealing with change. And change causes confrontation, it causes claims, it causes disputes. And we haven't got good mechanisms embedded in the contract to deal with these conditions. They're designed as static instruments of control, not flexible instruments that can accommodate dynamic change. And that is a different story, but it is very much part of this story, because if you have something that's so fixed and so unable to adapt and adjust, then by its nature, it is not collaborative.
Yeah, true. Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, we covered a lot of ground here, Tim.
I think so. We'll be back again later in a couple of weeks' time, I think, with our next round of the negotiation room, our next triumvirate. This was our special edition, and I hope everybody's enjoyed it and been able to walk away with some thought-provoking ideas and insights. So, Keld, thank you so much for joining me. And
thank you, Tim.
Until next time, we'll say goodbye.
Bye.